Well, good morning, ladies. I don't know when the other folks will show up, but we'll get started because it's 10:30 and it's time for brainstorming the human connection. And today we actually were planning to have Julia Lyon on, and she's a nonfiction children's book writer. And that's a kind of a specialty because a lot of children's books are sort of fantasies, but she writes books for children that have to do with real issues, real events, and real things in the known and tangible universe. But unfortunately, she became ill and couldn't make it. That said, we are still going to talk about children's books today. And there's a lot to talk about, but I don't want to be the only one talking because I already know what I think, and I'm interested in what you folks think and kind of your experiences. So we're going to be talking about children's books, but also we're going to be talking about what impact do books have on children? What are their potential impacts? What impact has it has on you more particularly? And how can we utilize books to improve our experiences in life, starting from a child? How can we improve children's educational experience through books? All of those kinds of things and more we'll be kind of tossing over. And I'm sure that you have some kind of experience with books, even if you've never read one. They've read you, you're on their agenda. So we're going to get started, and we'll wait for the other folks to come and join us as Carolyn lets them in. So to talk a little bit about, to get the conversation started anyway, to explore a little bit about the children's book world. Children's books actually have been growing, at least in sales. And there's a caveat when we say that the market has been growing, because the people who put out the reports and who do the studies, at least the ones I found, they seem to be more interested in reporting how much publishers make than how many books are purchased and by whom. And of course, it would be very difficult to tell if they were actually read or not. And a book just selling is not really a thing for me. It might mean something. I'm certain it means something to publishers, but the question is, do they read it and the impact that it has? But the information that I can get is mostly about the increase in total registered sales. That means that there are certain companies that pay retailers, especially the large ones like, your Barnes and Nobles, your Amazons, and those, they collect data from the receipts. In other words, when a book is sold, it is that scanning that goes into a database that says a book was bought, it was bought for this amount of money. Okay. So according to that, and that's the metric we're going to use, that's why I made the point of telling you what we're talking about, is really, it tells you how much increase in sales were made. Maybe gross, probably not the net, but the gross. But we can extrapolate some things, or we can tell some things about that. And one of the things we can tell, at least, is that there is more money turned over. Now, if we fudge a bit and say, okay, well, that means more books were sold, not saying it does, but if we say that, then it means that there's actually has been an increase in book sales at the rate of about 3% a year over time, or, averaged out. One of the interesting things is, like, during the time of the COVID pandemic, actually book sales went up. But overall, since 2012, book sales have been going up, which is kind of different than what we think about. And we're talking children's books now. It's kind of different than what we think, because we think, oh, the kids are just on these devices, electronic devices, and I didn't have one when I was a kid, so it must be bad. But actually, they have been reading books that booksellers sell at an increasing rate. So we can talk about, whether that's, a good thing and why. That's one of the things that can come up. But I think it's important to note that actually young people, particularly children, are reading more. At least we're going to think that that's the case. It could be that the books are just more expensive, and so that's why they're making more money, or there's more sales. But that's the best I could do as far as, like, finding out, the number of units that were sold. There may be that information out there, but I couldn't find it from a reliable source. Okay. So that said, I'd like to switch now and talk about your experiences with reading. I started reading before I went to school, and I started reading by looking at the comic strips. The Sunday paper would come, or the daily paper, and I would go to the comic strips because they had pictures in them. And then I would look at the words and ask whoever the victim was close to me, what is that word in the book? And I should say, I started reading before I knew my alphabet. And I kind of read like people read ideograms. I just memorize what those things look like. And then I tried to memorize that word. I didn't know about phonics and all of that stuff until I could kind of read the comic strips. And most of the comic strips I read was like that would appeal to a preschooler. And so, or that could be understood by the pictures, or the pictures were interesting enough, like a Snoopy or something like that. So they didn't have a lot of words in them, but that's when I started reading, and that's how I started reading. If anyone read to me as a kid, I have no recollection of that. I always remember reading alone, and I don't remember my parents sitting around reading the newspaper. I don't remember my older brothers, or I don't have an older brother, my older sister, or anyone else in my family reading. Though we got the newspaper, so they must have read sometime, because why would you keep getting the newspaper, But it wasn't a thing that in my memory, I remember my parents doing. So I'd like to open it up to all of you now to talk about your early experience in reading. When do you first remember reading? Anybody? Do we have any readers? Do, 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 do. Anybody interested? When were you first interested in reading, or when did you first remember reading? Well, let's go back before that. Do you ever remember anybody reading to you? Cheryl?
I'll hop in. I do not remember anyone ever reading to me. And honestly, one of the things that I remember reading one summer that made me feel like a reader was I read all of the Laura Ingalls Wilder series.
Oh, wow. So can you remember about how old you were? 6, 7?
I don't know. I want to say that I really don't recall if it was like that 4th, 5th grade time frame, but it just felt so accomplished to do that. And I think really that's what took off. I was really a reader after that. I always had a book going, I think, after that.
So, as you say, you don't remember people reading to you, but do you remember people around you reading?
No.
No. Now, it should be said that at that age, a lot of things that happen, fortunately, get erased, you know.
Yes.
Unfortunately, some of the residuals are there, but we can't like functionally use that memory because it isn't clear and it's so sketchy. But I think that it would be notable if you could remember the reading, because probably it was something that happened more than once. And it's more likely to have been a pleasurable experience.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I remember we lived in a small town. I remember walking to the library by myself in grade school, the public library, and just being really enamored with the books and the space. But yeah, I don't, my mother was a sewer, and she was also musically inclined. So a lot of her time was spent at the piano. So I guess it really kind of was a form of reading, the music and the words that went with the music that she was playing. And the time that I spent with my grandmother, I don't recall her reading either, because if her hands were idle, she was probably crocheting.
Yes. Okay.
So yeah, it's interesting when you ask that question, because I've been a big one to read to my grandchildren and to my children, but I guess when I really think about it, it isn't because of an experience that I necessarily had. But I don't know that anything would have been different. I mean, I read to my children, but I don't know that they're necessarily readers. So.
Interesting. I think one of the things that could/should be said is that the act of reading has some prerequisites. In other words, there are some things that, at least in the abstract, should be in place. And that is two that come to mind right away are leisure time and discretionary income. Okay. If you lack one or both of those, you are less likely, if not unlikely, to read. Because reading, unlike listening to the radio, requires that pretty much you put everything else down and pay attention. It's one thing to listen to music on your car radio. It's another thing to even talk to someone on the phone. It gets dicier when you're texting, but if you're engrossed in a book, it's probably not too good. It's it probably is not going to be a good day. So you have to have, and it's the same with like, you can't, well, I'll say it's hard to, let's say, wash dishes and read a book. You're going to have to choose which one of those things you're doing. That's why I like audiobooks, by the way, is because you can wash dishes. In fact, you feel better about washing dishes. It's not so boring if you have something else going on. But for most of human history and for most of humankind at this point, reading a book means that you have, one, the money to buy the book, and two, the time to read it. And the time to read it means that it's time you don't have to be making money. Now, it's not to say that only rich people can read, though that has been the case through much of human history. But it means that the cost to you to read is going to be higher simply because how much money you're not making doing something else while you're reading. However, reading can, enhance your ability to leverage your income. So it's not to say it's a losing proposition. It means that on the front end, that those are some considerations, not the only ones, but that is a consideration.
But I don't think people I think we're very materialistic. So a lot of times we think we need to own those books.
Yes.
And we absolutely need to utilize our public libraries. And we need to utilize the Reach literacy bookstores that are around, and utilize all of those things on our behalf, but also ultimately they help others as well.
Exactly. If they help us, it can help us to help others, and it helps others because they can be helped in the same way we're helped. Excellent point, Cheryl.
Lawrence, I would say along the lines of what you're talking about buying books and what Sherilyn just said about libraries, my earliest memories of reading are my dad worked during the week, but he was home on the weekends, and every Sunday he would be sitting down reading the newspaper. And if I climbed on his lap, he would read me that newspaper word for word. If I got down, he'd just read to himself. But if I was there, he was reading whatever he was reading out loud because that was important to him.
Right.
And it was not uncommon on the weekends for him to take me to Carl Munt Library, which at the time was on DSC campus. It's now DSU campus. And he was taking a couple classes there, but while he did his thing, I would just look through it wasn't really designed for little kids, but there was always somebody in that library that would read something to me. I would pick something off the shelves and they would read it. Or I'll never forget going through the racks and racks of newspapers that they had hanging there, And,
Yes.
so I think that was important, and he instilled that in us at a very young age. Like, go to the library. You can't, we didn't have the money back then to buy the books or to buy the newspaper, but we still read them. And I guess I'll never, that's always been a good memory for me, as long as I can remember. If I was next to him, he was reading out loud, no matter what it was. If he was cooking and looking at the recipe on the box, if I was standing there, he was reading that out loud instead of just to himself. And so that's what I tried to do with my kids when they were younger too. And one of them is a huge avid reader, and the other one's not so much. But, I tried.
The same medicine affects people different, Absolutely.
Lawrence, if I could add a comment as well.
Sure.
So, and what Carolyn just said is reading is a very personalized thing too. Having been in the education system for many years, I often heard teachers talk about, well, this kid won't read or that kid won't read. And, we understand the struggles that come with that. And I think you made some very valid points earlier as well about the socioeconomic part of it. But one thing too, is I'll just share from my own experience, and it's kind of somewhat similar to something that Carolyn just talked about. But for me, I was into sports. That was something growing up that I could see, obviously, in my dad. He was a fanatic, if you will, about high school basketball. And so one thing that he used to do would be to make these sheets of paper that had the names of every high school basketball team in the state of South Dakota. And then when the scores would come out every night or whenever the games were in the newspaper, he would take the newspaper and proceed to literally write the scores down for every team. And he did this for years and years. And so even as an elementary kid growing up, that was something that I grabbed onto, if you will, and it was like, yeah. And of course, my already being a sports fan, and then seeing how important it was to him to keep track of that. So that was a little bit different take on it. It wasn't necessarily a book per se, but he also then became an avid collector of the Hanson and Anderson South Dakota basketball preview. That was something that was published every year, and I don't know if it's still to this day, as far as I know it is, but and that's where I gained so much knowledge about all of the communities in the state of South Dakota and sports, and learning all their nicknames. And of course, a lot of that's changed now with the consolidation of schools and things. But that was just something that, because sports was such an interest of mine, and I could see that in my dad, and again, his taking an interest by going to that length to keep track of all that information. That was something that really had an impression on me, and I wanted to read everything I could from that point on, and learn everything I could relative to basketball and sports. So.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's interesting that those kind of ramps are very important. Like if there's something that you're interested in and you get pointed to a resource to satisfy that interest, if it's reading, people will make the effort to learn to read. That said, if you don't seem like, it doesn't seem like anything that you're likely to read is of interest to you, even if you know how to read, you're less likely to read. I'm reminded once of a conversation, and I've heard this conversation in different iterations over time, about boys not liking to read, especially like young teenage boys. And this one librarian says, well, it depends, because he said that was a kind of party line for years. She said, but then Lord of the Rings came out, and the Harry Potter came out, and suddenly teenage boys, 13, 14, were spending hours sitting with their friends, reading and even discussing those books. Said, well, if people write books that boys want to read, they will read. If it's something they're interested in, they will read. And I think that's the important thing here, is not that should be the only thing that they read, but to get people interested in reading and continue interested in reading. I think that ramp is important. Angie, did you have something to contribute to our conversation?
Sure. My story with reading is a little bit different. It's not quite as warm and fuzzy as the rest of yours. When you're a child growing up in a not so great environment, where your parents don't spend time with you and you don't see people reading, for me, it was a form of escape to somewhere better. It was a form of freedom, to create something and be a part of something that felt better, kind of fantastical, the fantasy, taking yourself to somewhere different. I was more so of an artist and drawer, but when you can create drawings and then with learning to read, you can actually create your own stories, draw out the stories. And even today, I think my reading tends to revolve around the healing aspect of continuing that, that childhood trauma that I think that's kind of the stage where I'm at now, is where my reading tends to focus around areas of self-help, healing, that sort of thing. But it's still a sense of freedom for me, and taking yourself somewhere better.
Sure. Interesting. Can you talk a little bit about some of those places you took yourself to in books?
Oh, boy. Anything that had a happy ending.
So did you read the last 2 pages first and say, okay, this has a happy ending, I'll go back and see what led to that?
No, I think I would gravitate towards things that had like a happy front cover, I think that would grab you. Anything that, just even the artistry, if it had joyful colors and a joyful expression. So I would gravitate towards those kind of things than something that might look like there was a struggle in there.
Yeah. So did you identify with, I mean, you talked about that it had a happy ending, but did you also identify with the struggle that the characters or were involved in?
Most certainly. I think I tend to gravitate towards Hallmark movies because they're happy endings. However, every single Hallmark movie, there is struggle in there, conflict of some sort. So I think it helps you move through that and say, oh, I'm not alone. I'm not the only one that faces conflict or situations in life that aren't great.
Well, that's a very, I would say, even an astute observation about reading and finding struggles that you can identify with, because not being alone in that struggle can make it go a lot better. And the fact that somebody's actually sat down and wrote a story about it, when you reflect on it, it's like, oh, not even just myself and this other person in this book knows about it. It must be something that's, that I have some potential collaborators, somebody out there who understands me.
Mhm.
Interesting. Stay with us. We got more questions. Okay, so tell us a little bit about whether or not you saw yourself reflected in the books you read. Did you? Can you tell us about any case where you found, oh, that's me, or that's something that I experienced?
Are you still asking me?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. Well, there was mention of the Little House on the Prairie books. And since I was a very, very small child, I would always draw the same picture over and over, almost like I was bringing in a previous life knowledge, that I didn't. And some people believe that and some people don't. It's okay either way. But from the smallest, the time I can remember, I would always draw myself as a prairie woman, with the horse and the wagon and just the bare necessities. And then I had 2 kids, and it was just me and the 2 kids, and I would be climbing up a hill, and like I was wandering, looking for something. And so even in the pictures that I would draw as a small child over and over, they all had the same element of climbing up a hill, like a struggle. And, like I was born in the wrong era or something. So I can identify with that, they back in that era, they really did have some struggles. But it was a simpler life too, where you didn't have a lot of that stuff that you have today, the chaos and the I don't know. I think life is not simple anymore.
Yeah, I think it's all kind of relative too, it's like the simplicity, because when you read those ancient books, like the Socrates or Plato and stuff like that, and you read like what they were writing about, it's like it doesn't seem that much different. They didn't have an iPhone, but they certainly had all of this stuff that they talk about on Facebook, essentially they were talking about it then.
Mhm.
I remember this one quote that was, loosely quoted, that said, like the world more or less is going to hell in a handbasket. Wives no longer obey their husbands, children are juvenile delinquents, and don't obey the elders and all of that. And it was 800 BC. So so in fact, another addendum to that was Julius Caesar at one point had to call troops from some of his conquests to go and put down riots by teenagers in Rome. So when you consider, well, none of this is new. It's like we have so far not called in the National Guard to put down like just teenage riots, so far. So I'm calling that an improvement. Call me liberal, but I'm calling it an improvement. Thank you for that. I want to ask some other folks too to join in and talk about your experience reading. When did you start reading, and what kind of experiences did you have as a result of reading? Anybody? Well, I'm going to move on, but ponder those things for a while. I'd like to share your experiences with reading as a child. But now I want to go to, as adults now, we have some opportunities to influence young readers. So what kind of things could we do to encourage young people to read? What kind of things as adults could we do to encourage young people to read?
I'll start with probably a pretty obvious one, but as we've been talking about how reading is a very personal thing, and people like to read, just all kinds of different things. It's really all about finding out what is it for specific kids that interests them, especially young. We want kids to learn to read as young as is possible, and connecting with kids and learning what are their interests, because every kid will tell you, even maybe without you asking, what they like, what they don't like. And so tapping into what are the interests that kids have, and then helping them understand that there are all kinds of opportunities out there to learn more about those interests. So that would be the obvious answer to that. So, or one of the obvious answers.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Very helpful. Anyone else? Angie, do you have any ideas?
I would just say an obvious one of just buy them books, but for me, I didn't have people spend a lot of time with me growing up. So I've noticed that in my trying to fill holes in myself, that if I read or spend time with a child, they're more likely to, continue that. So buy a book and then read it with them to get, to foster that interest in reading.
Mm-hmm. Any other ideas? Anyone? Ideas? How do we encourage young people to get started or continue reading?
I think Kobe and Angie are both on to something there. And my son, when he was in middle school, did not want to read much. Like, he always had read, but then he kind of quit, and he wasn't interested, and he wasn't doing good in the reading classes anymore. And I finally had a meeting with the teachers, and I said, he's not interested in what you guys are talking about in the least. Like, give him a chance to read this thing about basketball that he's really been reading at home, and let him write your little report on that and see how he does. And he did amazing, you know. And so then it was, let's work something out where every other assignment you do what the teacher wants, and then every other one she'll let you do what you want, you know, let you know that it's not all bad. Some things you have to read because you need to know the information, but sometimes you can just read for pleasure. So I think like what Kobe said is really important, and making sure you're in tune with what the person's interests are, what the child's interests are. But then just letting them see you read, letting them see other people read, and letting them see that it can be fun and interesting and engaging, and don't make it out to be a chore. But then also making sure that they have access to books. You know, through one of our young readers book programs that South Dakota Humanities does, you know, one of the first years we got a message back from a 3rd grade student who said she was so thrilled because she had never had her own book before, you know.
Wow.
And so for us, it was just like, whoa, you know, what do you mean? But, you know, we just by giving her a book, we could have opened a whole world for her and a whole new love of reading for that one child. And just making sure that kids know that even if you don't have the money to buy the book, you can go to the library. You can still get the book. You can still read. You can still have that escape. And I've heard from many people with a story like Angie's that reading was kind of an escape from their reality. And just to let people know that that is out there, that's a possibility, and it can help, and it can be therapeutic. And I think just sharing that knowledge, we got to share that knowledge with them from a very young age, you know. So
Well, speaking of
that's my input.
well, speaking of libraries, a very good point. I think taking children to libraries is important because at the time that I would like to see them start reading, they may be too young to go to the library by themselves, certainly too young to get a library card without the assistance of an adult. And it may be intimidating. In fact, if you're like a preschooler and you walk into a library, somebody will probably think you're lost, you know. And then in addition to that, you're not tall enough to see over, you know, even up to the books. And one of the interesting design things is, even though they have books, you know, and libraries seem to be at least more, let's say, more cognizant of, or more aware, I should say, of the fact that the little people can't see the books that's way up on the high shelves. And I think what's happened is the books have been designed for adults. In other words, it's expected that an adult will come into the library with a child and is not going to get down on all fours to look at that bottom rack where the kid can see the book. So that's a design issue that probably has to be worked out as to, well, where do you put the books so that that kids can access them even after they get to the library. But I think like going to the library and having a regular time too, to go to the library with a child could be a thing, you know. It could be something where you look forward to doing that, especially if there's something else interesting, you know, like talking to other kids about a book or something like that. It can be as exciting as any playground, you know, if you have a space where kids can talk about books, and especially if there's some adult supervision / guidance in helping them to, you know, to know what's in the book and what the story's about. Yeah. Any other ideas about how to encourage young people to be engaged with reading? Anyone else want to open up your mic, and then we can tell you have something to contribute to this conversation. Well, I have a few more that may spark some comment from you. I think that engaging young people in discussions about what they are reading can be something that encourages them to read. A lot of times people, let's say, they don't seem interested in the thing that the child is interested in. And if they don't seem interested in what the child is interested in, they're not likely to engage in a conversation, because even adults express difficulty, or you see them have difficulty in having conversations or starting conversations with other adults. And they seem to have even more of a problem having a conversation with a child. And when I say conversation, I mean an eye-level discussion, not me tell you what to do and what to think, but like an exchange, something where a person gets to exercise expressing what they feel or think and listening to what others feel and think. The exercise and practice of that is not a lot, let's say it's not often available even to adults, let alone between adults and kids. However, that said, there's no reason why it couldn't be, at least no reason I could find. So maybe that's an area that we can explore, how to, just practice, try something, ask an open question. Hey, you read anything lately? What are you reading? This, and even if they're reading nothing, the fact that somebody asked them something, that hey, are you reading? Like there's an expectation that you're reading, because we will ask kids about something like basketball. We'll say, hey, how'd the game go? Some people will ask. Some people just don't talk to kids, but they're afraid of kids. Maybe they think they're Lilliputians or something. But if you ask, like, well, what was that? What have you read lately? What was that about? And who are the characters? Or what did you learn from that? Or is there anything that you think that you can benefit from that story? And or how did that make you feel? Those kind of open questions, and then wind them up and let them go. And then if they feel something, if at least I found that if the moment you let a child know, especially pre-13, you let them know that you're interested in something that they're interested in, and it's just like you got one of those cockleburrs on a wool suit. You'll never get rid of them suckers after that. They'll be on, because it's not every day that anybody listens to them, and especially somebody who's reading. Often they're there because that's their whole world. Nobody, the rest of the world doesn't exist for them. People don't know that they feel like, anyway, nobody knows they exist. Unless they break a window, then suddenly everybody realizes they exist. But other than that, they don't notice, So I think when people just say, hey, what was that book about? Or what are you reading? As though it's an expectation. And then even if they didn't, I'm not reading anything. Why not? There's some interesting things, or just, at least I do that on a regular basis, even with kids I don't know, because sometimes that's the way you get to know them, or that's the way they get to know themselves. I may never see them again. Most often that's the case. I never see them again. And, but I feel I can contribute that little thing to them, that somebody that sort of like floated in from this other parallel universe came in and said, what book are you reading? And then disappear again. But if that's a unique experience, it probably is one that they will remember. I have more, but anybody else have ideas, something that they think can help encourage young people to read?
And Lawrence, I'll add a comment again. So I think
Sure.
Carolyn mentioned it earlier, and it's something that seems maybe in a lot of ways like, well, yes, but then I don't know how much it's actually done, is again, just allowing kids to hear adults read. It happens in school. We know that teachers do that, but outside of that, when kids go home to their families, having their parents read to them, or with their brothers and sisters, whatever the case might be, it's just something that, especially because, again, coming from an educational background, a lot of times, and most of my background is with middle school and secondary, middle and high school students. So that's where I'm coming from. But a lot of kids, they just maybe don't have the opportunity outside of school to hear other people, fluent readers, read. And there's a lot of reasons for that. Life's busy, parents are busy, et cetera, but that's really critical. And again, if it's only the teachers in the school that are reading to kids, there's just a lot more, I think, in terms of that can be done once kids leave the school building at the end of every day, in terms of generating excitement, helping them, gain a better appreciation and more of a desire to want to read. If people around them in their personal lives are reading, they're going to be more likely to do that. So,
Excellent point, Colby. Lee, did you have?
I just figured it out.
Yeah. Well, welcome back. I haven't seen you for, it seems like forever, but it looks like you're returning to being a teenager now.
I don't know what it is. I could not believe it. Yeah, I was a non-reader, in a way. And I was a non-reader and became a reading teacher. One of the things I heard most of your conversation is importance of your background. The only thing I can remember reading, my dad picked up the newspaper and I said, "What's that funny word?" And it was Jap. And I said, "What is that?" Now that would be during World War II. And having said that, that was my first knowing that my parents read. And so then I really tried every trick I could think to get in school to be able to keep my grades up or down or whatever. I listened a lot. And eventually I just put it in my mind, I'm going to teach myself to read. And I think one of the most important things is that they are read to when they're little. So that's what I did to my kids when I raised them. And I would always go to the library. And today my daughter, who's in her 60s, said one of her most pleasant things about growing up was going to the library and getting 14 books and for all of us to read. Read to your children at a young age, even if they can't read. Read to them if they can read. At the end of life, I have found that you can read to them. Their hearing is the last thing. Reading is the foundation of us as people, as humans, our way of communication that is unique to us as beings on this earth. Read, demonstrate, be patient, understand, and yes, finding topics that they are first interested in. They will read a difficult book beyond their quote grade level. There's not such a thing as a grade level. Anyway, having said that, I gave my little speech and waiting for me, and I just figured out how to do this thing with all.
Excellent, excellent. And thank you so much. I think Carolyn has some folks who from the Facebook have some comments. You want to share those? with
Yeah,
us,
there's
Carolyn?
just a couple comments on Facebook. Mary Alice says, I asked my 12-year-old grandson what he was reading in school. He told me he was reading Tulsa 1921. I had never heard of this story. We had a great discussion. The child taught the adults.
Yeah.
And then Deb Delaney said she learned to read in first grade with Dick and Jane books. She doesn't remember her parents reading to her. Her dad read the paper, but her mom was too busy to read.
Yeah. You know, I should add that one of the things my parents saved money and actually paid on an installment plan was a set of encyclopedias. You know, that was like the mark of a family that was to be considered relevant, you know, and it was a foundation. It's having an encyclopedia. Now, having said that, I still can't remember my parents ever reading the encyclopedias. They were more like something for us. But being a dyslexic and not having any idea that there was even such a thing as dyslexia, reading was not my primary way to get information. It was only like, okay, if that's the only way that information is available, then it can't be helped, you know. But if there was any other way, like going to talk to somebody, then I would do that, you know. And I didn't realize that whole dyslexic thing until much later. And I bring that up because it's important when we think about reading to realize that reading is an unnatural act. It's not something that let's say, we can do without instructions. There are lots of things that, you know, even like speaking, you watch a kid and they're especially babies, and they're watching your mouth and they're listening and they're very intent, and they're trying to see how you make those sounds, and they try to make it. They don't go to English class, baby English classes. They just learn how to do it and they figure stuff out. The brain is ready to do that. When you put something in their mouth, you don't have to show them a YouTube video on how to swallow and chew food. They manage to get it down. So there are some things that are natural. They're natural acts. We learn to walk. Even if somebody has to support us, we figure out that whole balance thing ourselves, and we're inquisitive, you know, and you know, we can learn from our experiences. Reading, on the other hand, is something that is fabricated, and different places have different ways that they write, and therefore different ways that they read, some left to right, some right to left, some up to down, some down to up, various ways. And so I mentioned that because sometimes we can oversimplify how difficult it is to read, because we think if we do it easy, that should be easy for everyone else. That's the way we usually teach reading, as though it's just natural. You should just do it, you know, or follow this particular rule, not realizing that what that person sees may not be what you see. I mean, how would we know that until recently we had tests to show that? But like many things, we assume that the experience that we have is the concrete reality, and that other people just have to learn to see it as we see it, or read as we read. And that is, in many ways, unfortunately, not the case. At least it's not a workable case. And it's, you know, so when we're trying to encourage people to read, that's a thing to keep in mind, that, you know, how people come to read, what they read, how they read, may be very personal, and then helping them to find their own way might be useful. And that includes helping them to find something that they're interested in reading. Any other ways that we can help encourage young people to read? Anybody else? Well, while you're thinking about it, I'll throw out another idea. Some people belong to book clubs. And inviting young people, because when I say young people, I don't mean just toddlers, you know, I mean, that could be like middle school, high school, in my case, 60 years old, you know, so it depends, you know, but and if you belong to a book club, inviting young people to that book club, you know, and or at least letting them know that you go to a book club, you know, because sometimes people have to be validated, their experiences have to be validated. And so if they can feel like, well, I'm not a freak for wanting to go and read a book and discuss it, there are people who do that too. That may be encourage someone to read. And I know that's a case that it was kind of a case like that in neighborhoods that I've grown up in, is that the kid who was reading had no, let's say, community support for that activity. You know, that was not something that the other kids like say, wow, John reads. He reads a lot. Unless it was like kind of like John's reading again. You know, it's like there was something like you're kind of a freak if you're reading. But I think having adults that appreciate that you read, and even other kids too, but having it as a thing that people read, I think that could be encouraging as well. Anyone else have any other ideas?
Well, we've kind of talked about it. You just mentioned it, Lawrence, you know, having adults read with kids and all of that. But, and again, with the Humanities Council, having the Young Readers One Book program where students, all third grade kids all across the state have the opportunity to interact with people who are professional, you know, who are authors and illustrators. That's been a really neat program for many years now. But yeah, just people who are authors, and we have so many of them who make a living writing stories for other people to read. Having those people talk to kids, you know, we can't always do that, but anytime we get an opportunity to do that, that generates a lot of excitement among kids, about gives them a different perspective about reading. So
Well, there certainly are lots of things to read. There are more books printed now than in any point in history. There are more opportunities for people to write. And books, of course, are not the only thing to read. There are journals to read. There are just reports with data in it to read. There are books that teach us how to see from using fictional stories and showing us other experiences that teach us a lot of combinations that may be harder to find, though I find that real life is often stranger than fiction. But finding those kind of experiences and finding the kind of things, the kind of reports, the kind of even signs, even reading signs can be quite interesting. But that's to say that there's many things to read. Books are a nice packaging of the information. But it's worth mentioning that, at least for me, I found that there's two reasons that people read: for information and for sensation. Books make you feel something different, or books bring you new things to know. And among the new things to know that sometimes crosses over into new ways to feel is vocabulary. And vocabulary becomes important because it allows us to keep track of the things we know and the things we feel. They're markers that help the brain make sense of them by putting them in an order in which they're easier to recall. There's a lot of information that we can get from books, and I hope you've gotten a lot of information from this conversation today, and that in the near future, like next Thursday, you'll come back and we'll share more information and more ideas. And I hope you guys will come back and add something to our conversation. With that, I think we'll say goodbye until next week. Same time, same station. Party on.